Hello, everyone. I know we have quite a few participants joining us in the waiting room right now and coming in, but welcome. It's great to have you all. My name is Casey Dolan. I'm the Senior Cybersecurity Policy Analyst at the National Governors Association. Again, welcome to each of you for joining our webinar today to discuss the growing move towards zero trust and how some of our states are leading efforts to implement zero trust architecture. We have a great group of speakers joining us today who are going to share a bit about their experiences with zero trust principles and solutions. Before I turn it over to them, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. First, this call is for invited guests only, and we hope that you all will feel comfortable speaking freely and asking questions throughout our discussion. We are recording today and will be uploading this session to our Resource Center for State Cybersecurity as soon as possible. Because we are utilizing the webinar feature of Zoom, everyone has been muted upon entry. If at any point of the presentation you have questions arise, we encourage you to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit those. Only our NGA team and panelists will be able to see these questions, and we'll monitor them to make sure that we get those answers to you. We also have reserved the last 10 to 15 minutes of today's call for any remaining discussion and audience questions. Finally, if you have any technical issues or questions, please feel free to send a note to any of our NGA staff in the chat box. I believe you can toggle your recipients there. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mitch Spalding, a senior solutions engineer at Okta, who has been working closely on this issue in several states. He's going to get us kicked off with a conversation with the state chief information security officers from both Iowa and Illinois. We're joined by Shane Dwyer and Adam Ford. We're super grateful to have these three experts joining us today, and we're excited to highlight their work. Mitch, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Casey. Much appreciated. Yeah, so to kind of tee up the conversation around zero trust, right? I think we first need to kind of understand where we came from before we can even kind of start talking about what zero trust means and what it is. So, prior to zero trust, the way that organizations would go about defining access to different networks and different resources really kind of depends upon this like castle and moat approach that organizations often implemented. Essentially, if a given user was on the network, right, that meant that a given user was trusted because you could see them in the office as an example, and they were then able to access that given resource without any additional validation. But if a user was off the network, right, that meant that the user either had to provide some sort of validation to prove who they say they are, or the user was just not allowed to access that given resource because they were off the network. Hence that castle and moat definition there. So where zero trust now kind of comes in is that that castle and moat approach really isn't scalable anymore in the 21st century. You figure you have users who are working remotely. They're using a plethora of different devices to do what they need to do their job function. And on top of that, you have not the same controls they used to over your on-premise resources. You have a lot of different applications and services they are using that are migrating to the cloud, and you can no longer just say that if a given user is on the network that they're by default trusted. So that's where now zero trust is, and that's where zero trust comes in. In 2009, John Kindervag coined the term for zero trust based upon the fact that we're now no longer going to say that the network by default is trusted. Essentially, any network traffic is now to be deemed untrusted. And so that's where he started. He started by providing the guidance for organizations to start segmenting the different networks. And essentially, in order to access a given network segment or a given resource, you had to validate yourself in one way, shape, or form. Or if you were to then pivot to another network segment, right, you then had to validate yourself. So we started with that network segmentation. And now where zero trust is today is we have a software-defined perimeter that's working dynamically instead of in a static fashion. That's now all about continuously assessing and continuously authenticating a given individual before they can ever gain access to a given resource here. And the Center for, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, I think lays this out perfectly in terms of, where zero trust is. You have the identity pillar. you have the device pillar, you have the network and environment pillar, you have the application and data pillar, right? All those components make up that software-defined perimeter that allows individuals to, again, prove who they say they are before they can go ahead and gain access to a specific resource. So again, just to provide some additional clarity here, zero trust is a concept. It's a framework. It's a type of methodology for going about and deploying, a defense in depth strategy for protecting your users and your different resources. For cybersecurity vendors, right, that say that they can go ahead and accomplish zero trust in one go, I just want to clarify that they are completely lying to you. As you can see there from the 5 pillars, there is not a single company or vendor that can go ahead and provide zero trust. As an example, I work at Okta, and we're solely focused on just that single identity pillar and how we can enable our partners that specify in the 4 other pillars to work with us. So again, that's really zero trust in a nutshell. I'll now go ahead and turn it over to Shane to kind of start explaining, where he is, right, from a zero trust perspective in the state of Iowa.
I appreciate that. Next slide, please. So I want to create some context and give some quick introductions in Iowa. So I've been in Iowa since September of 2021 and have been really focusing on modernizing the way we think about cyber across the state. And I'll put some definitions out there and also detail how we're approaching zero trust from our perspective. To how Mitch said it, we are focusing on the methodologies and applying those methodologies to the program, our statewide program. There is no single vendor that can solve these issues. There are vendors that can help solve these issues as part of that. So in my role, I am the state CISO. I am the principal executive reporting into the executive branch for the state of Iowa. And my primary focus is 3 different areas: to be able to support our state against foreign domestic threats, to be able to promote a cyber culture across the entire state as a whole state, and then also focus on resiliency and commoditizing cyber operations. Get really good at the things that we do and then figure out what we do with the things that we don't do well. Under Iowa Code 8B, it allows me to serve all 3 branches of government: the cities and counties of Iowa, education, and not-for-profit. This year, actually, we did some changes. We used to be a cabinet agency, the Office of the CIO. We realized that IT and specifically cybersecurity needed better visibility with the governor's office. And we motioned and session approved the Office of the CIO to move into the Department of Management. Our Department of Management in Iowa is a strategic arm of the governor and is really the risk manager for the state. So we're moving away from being reactive and more proactive in risk-based activities as part of that activity. Next slide, please. As we're going through these slides, I want you to think about these are practices we're doing in Iowa. They may not work for you. And I would probably assume that it's going to be the same for when Adam talks about Illinois. You have to think about opportunities as you're hearing this of things that you can do in your state to improve your cyber posture. And then think about things in the terms of cyber incidents, right? So when we do these things, we will hopefully see a reduction in cyber attacks, successful cyber attacks against us that have crippling impacts generally. Just kind of as a general rule, when I talk about these activities within Iowa or with anyone, we want our teams to really think about our environments, to pay attention to those environments, to have situational awareness, generally speaking. And then I think this is really critical in IT, have documented processes in architecture, which we're really bad at in IT. So we need to have extra focus on that generally. Next slide, please. So in Iowa, my position is a little different probably than many of the other states. My position has infrastructure. So our networks are firewalls and our data centers, but I also have information security. And that allows me to think about things from a critical infrastructure perspective, making sure that we have standardization in our infrastructure and we have the right security tools that are baked in. And I'm able to balance the agility of the business needs with the protections that are necessary to safeguard those environments. It also allows me to traverse, if you look at the right Venn diagram, cyber is not the center of the world, but it does have tentacles in the different areas. It has real world business impacts and enablements. It has technology impacts, and it also has legal impacts. And things that we do within these architectures are critical to safeguarding our lines of business and things we do every day. Next slide, please. And at the foundation of our state, we also have a cyber incident response team. And this is going to be really critical as we think about zero trust architecture. So we put together this last year a group that consisted of these entities. And essentially what it allows us to do is it allows us to focus on responding to any cyber threat against Iowa and bringing in uniformed service members or bringing in sworn law enforcement agents and really all of our partners across the board. And it makes us more nimble in those activities. We learned a lot over this past year and how attackers are successfully able to make it into our infrastructure and things that we should be doing to stop that in the future. And that's really a big part of that, is thinking about those kill chain type activities and applying that in prioritization for zero trust. Next slide. We also feed into our federal partners. So we have a really strong relationship at Region 7 with our CISA team, with the Omaha, Nebraska Federal Bureau of Investigations, the Fusion Center, IMSSAC, and U.S. Department of Homeland Security. We can't do this job without them. So we need to be able to look at intelligence and prioritize all the things that we're doing, because we do have a limited amount of resources when we think about implementing zero trust. Zero trust is a huge project. It's going to take multiple years, if not decades, to truly accomplish. You know, we don't have the funding of the Department of Defense. We just don't. So we have to think about how do we best use those resources. Next slide. I also want to highlight some definitions as I think about, you know, zero trust. So in this world, there's something called system interconnection. So that's a connection from one system to another system. That could be a client, a desktop or a laptop that connects to a desktop or a laptop, or a server to a laptop, or any type of connection. But also when we think about the second definition, security boundaries. So I call that an ecosystem in Iowa. So what that means is if a system is querying data for answer response, if a system is sending data, or a system is sharing data, we consider that an interconnection. Now, those could be ports, protocols, and services. Those could be APIs. Those could be VPN connections for users. We think about those segments in those regards. So just to make sure everyone has an understanding of those definitions. Next slide. And this is kind of our roadmap. We are taking a whole state approach when we think about cyber across the state. Many of these activities are in motion, and we are really pushing these across the board. So I think at the very forefront, when I first came here, one of the things I realized is we needed to have a really robust and strong inventory of the systems that we have. For me, as the CISO, it's really difficult for me to protect what I don't know. So we focused on that specifically. And then we spent extra time and we deployed an endpoint detection and response tool and got that into preventative mode. And what that allows us to do is really safeguard those endpoints that are capable of having this tool in place. So it doesn't require human intervention to stop an attack, right? That's one of the things that I learned very quickly. Getting phone calls at 2 o'clock in the morning, the tools we had were detective and not preventative. That has saved us a lot of attacks and a lot of time, generally speaking. But with that deployment, we were able to also deploy scanless vulnerability assessment and be able to see in real time the vulnerabilities that are on the system, and also inventory the hardware and software of all of those systems. So it really created this whole suite of knowledge that helped us think about zero trust more broadly. It identified where we had issues, systems that we may have not seen that were out in the cloud or out at someone's house, that they were working from home, and really focused on that. The other piece that we really focused on, and this is really, in my mind, the core of zero trust identity, right? So we want to trust the people who are coming into our environments, every single endpoint at some level. We want to create trust so when they come in, we know how much access they should have. So we went through an activity where we inventoried accounts and really thought about those things from a risk perspective. We worked with Okta to identify those accounts, work those into our tenant, and then applied multi-factor across the board. At this point in time, our state staff are in the Okta tenant for multi-factor authentication. And I'll talk about some of the future plans and how we're thinking about the rest state of approach in those regards. And we're really at the point now where we're thinking about two different words of art here. The first is authenticator assurance levels, and the second is identity assurance levels. So really it's trying to think about, a person's coming into my environment, do I truly know are they truly who they say they are? And are they actually getting access that they need for the business need that they have, right? So we really pair those together in thinking about somebody entering our systems. Next slide, please. And then we take that and we apply that to our interconnections. We think about, you're coming in, we want to make sure that our boundaries have the right security controls to protect you coming in those regards. Endpoint, a server, an API, we build the security around that. And then we integrate those AAL and IALs into those. So if I'm going from I'm a citizen to I am a worker in a county doing Medicaid, I have to change my role in those cases so I have additional security around those. So we think about that. But that's also all built on Section 4, which is our security analytics platform. And we're starting to really robustly build that process, and then also look at SOAR integration as part of that. What we want to do is we want to bring all these tools and technologies together in a way that they complement each other. And that's a big feat when we think about zero trust. It's not only the governance and the procedures, but the way we implement those technologies. And from my perspective, IT is there to automate business processes and protections around that. Next slide, please. So as we think about the architecture and as the way that I envision it today, this is kind of how I'm thinking about it. So you have somebody at the top who's coming in, doesn't matter what the interconnection is. Once they hit our systems, wherever it is, they would have to go and authenticate through Okta. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, those are business identified identities. So we already have the Workday HCM internal identities built. Those are fed into Okta, and we have those connections there. Over time, we want to create local government connections, partner connections, citizen connections. And that's important because as a person, a resource account, or any type of connection happens, it is always authenticating interconnections. It doesn't matter if it's commercial services, if it's an interconnection within our state, interconnection with any other state or any other entity, or in our state data centers, we are applying authentication at every single layer. So for example, we would build RDP gateways and make sure that when somebody comes in RDPs, they do it through a multi-factor authentication and through that identity service. And we feed all that data into our telemetry data lake, so we can look at and identify risks. So is somebody trying to log in Oconus? Are they logging in from a device we've never seen before? And we can take real-time action when we see something doesn't seem right. Next slide, please. And I think it would be a loss if we didn't also talk about, in detail how I see AAL and IAL levels. So if you look at the left-hand side, when you think about limited impact to the business, that low risk box really says, we have maybe unprotected data or open data that can be open to the public. Authentication and authorization probably don't need a whole lot of robust needs there. So we can usually give that based on a single factor to log in, or maybe no factor at all. Like Tableau, for example, and you're feeding data on maps, maybe you don't need to go and authenticate that. When you start moving to AA level 2, those have serious impacts to the business. Those may have protected information such as PHI or PII. You may not realize $1 million loss in the case. Maybe it's a $100,000 loss. You can kind of gauge what that risk loss is overall. And you can do a mix and match of different authenticators for multi-factor. And I think that's allows most of the flexibility. But when you look at AAL level 3, those are your most critical risks overall. That is also going to be your PII, PHI, but you may have $1 million of loss. And you want to have identity validation where you have somebody come into your area, you identify they're the person who they say they are in person by a trained person, and then you go and template the multi-factors in a way that it's resistant to breaking into. So there's pre-established structures within NIST that detail that, and AAL, IAL levels. With that, back to you, Mitch.
Excellent. Thanks, Shane. So what I think is just so interesting about the state of Iowa is just how you're going about zero trust from a holistic perspective. You're not only focusing on how to deploy zero trust at the state level, but you're also taking into account cities and counties and how you can go about hardening those systems as well. I think that's extremely forward thinking, and I think that's definitely a model that other states might be it might be worthwhile for them to consider, because that just means that their state would be way more best positioned, I think, to fend off a given cyber attack. So great, excellent points there.
And Mitch, I would add one more thing to that statement. I think about things in if a county or a city is compromised, there's a high likelihood that that compromised account or the compromised data center could compromise the state. And I think about those things from that risk profile perspective, and how do I How do I holistically raise those entities who may not be at that level to a place where they have some level of risk mitigation that protects us at the state level and protects the federal government? Really, that's what it comes down to. How do we do our part to be a good neighbor? Not only for the people who connect into us, people we connect to as well.
I couldn't agree more. It really begins to like have like that snowball effect there, right? Even just with a city user or another locality user, right? That could then snowball into all the way to the federal government. I think that's well said. So with that, Adam, would you care to share your take on what the state of Illinois is doing from a zero trust perspective?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Mitch. Great job, Shane. I'll build on a lot of the elements that Shane mentioned, and in fact, I stole a slide as an intro slide. We call this organic introductions. So, like Shane, I'm the statewide Chief Information Security Officer for the state of Illinois. Like Iowa, Illinois is a consolidated IT state. So I know many of the viewers here maybe from states where IT management or cybersecurity management is federated amongst a variety of different cabinet institutions. Here in Illinois, it's centralized. That does color to a certain degree the types of solutions and that we look to implement. I do think there's a lot of commonality between federated and centralized states in terms of what the end solutions look like. I think it's just, how many people are involved in making the soup can vary in a federated state. So in a centralized state, it's a little bit more simple to set forward a strategic direction, and then you basically begin moving cheese to try and drive towards that direction. In a federated state, I think it's more inviting people to bring a specific ingredient to the burgoo. I think that's a thing in Kentucky. I know we do it sometimes here in Illinois where everybody brings a component to make a soup. But at the end of the day, I think when we look at this from the perspective of security to serve residents, it's the same outcomes that we're driving towards. So my office, some CISOs are established and sit in various positions within their state. I sit directly under the state CIO, who's a cabinet level official. We're established here in Illinois in statute, which gives us quite a few advantages. Just kind of speaking to the whole of state approach and the different approaches at the various states that NGA often is working with advocacy for. Having a state statute has been really beneficial to the efficacy for our efforts here in the state of Illinois. I'm going to talk a little bit about a different nuance of identity than Shane, and talk specifically about the resident interaction with the state of Illinois. So if I can go to the next slide, I want to kind of lay the groundwork for where we were. This is still where we are on many systems, and where many states are, but today pre-COVID, right? So there has been a historical approach in states, and I think in the federal government as well, to build applications, internet-facing applications to serve residents that are really based on the program that they serve. So as different government programs were spun up or are modified either by the federal government and administered by the states, or created in different states, social services programs, natural resources programs. If there is a digital component to that and interaction of that, oftentimes that system was developed specifically for that program. So things like unemployment insurance, food benefits, hunting permits, camping, boat registration, motor vehicle registration. Those systems came online over the past 20 to 30 years. Some have been updated, but generally speaking, interoperability between those different applications was not a design requirement. Oftentimes there were different stakeholders making decisions. And the primary perspective, I think, that drove system design in most of those instances was the program and the agency and technical staff that were supporting it. It wasn't really an inward or an outward in approach, but it was a kind of pushing things out. So most of our legacy systems here in Illinois pre-pandemic, and I think across the country this is the same, were really designed more around how the government wishes to make the service available to the resident, rather than looking at how the resident can more easily interact with government across a variety of agencies. It can be something that happens, I think, that for those of us that are within government, to look at the world from the perspective of agencies. And generally speaking, residents don't see different agencies as a meaningful differentiator. They see the government of the state of Illinois as including all of the various agencies and not necessarily the distinguishing characteristics that is often common in agency employees. Prior to pandemic, prior to our current Zero Trust initiative that we're going to talk about here, the iLogin project, account services for residents would frequently be a call to the help desk. So many of you probably in your own states still have this situation. We have it very much in Illinois. Our journey here is ongoing. But if, depending on the service that you interact with, you may have to call someone to make a difference with your digital interaction. Next slide, please. This produces a lot of challenges, and this is where we found ourselves in March of 2020 here in the state of Illinois. Users had multiple accounts for state systems. They often didn't remember their passwords or their user IDs. There was an uncommon methodology for how the residents would interact with those systems. User identity verification for those systems was really pretty unsophisticated prior to the pandemic. I think, unemployment insurance fraud, the PUA fraud that was so wide scale across the country really opened the floodgates to sophisticated cybercrime attacking government services, and it's here to stay. So the notion that someone would have to do something other than provide some limited information about themselves to claim an account was kind of a foreign concept to state government and in general, with some rare exceptions. So in that kind of topology that we all found ourselves in, implementing modern security features is very difficult. It's very piecemeal. When you have 60 user repositories, different interactions that citizens have or residents have, that means you have to fix it 60 times. And again, you have that user frustration from password reset and from account identification. Even calling a help desk and describing the system can be kind of complicated. So here in Illinois, we had already determined that we wanted to go in a pathway where we could put a resident first system of user interaction with our state services. And the pandemic happened and it accelerated it from something that was maybe just a concept that we were talking about to just a base necessity. Here in Illinois, we've implemented Zero Trust for our user interactions with state services. We call this project or this product iLogin. If we go forward a slide, I'll hit that. And effectively, we utilize, like Shane, we happen to utilize Okta as the back end for it, but it's a single user access method for services across different resident-facing services. So you create a single account here, an iLogin account, and you're able to access a variety of state services using that same set of credentials. You don't necessarily have to know which agency you're directly interacting with. We can provide that to them and provide different hints as to applications that they might. For example, if you apply for one kind of benefits, then perhaps you might also qualify for a different type. We used here in Illinois commercially available software as a service. We didn't rebuild this. Sometimes standardizing is the way to innovate. And I think that's what we found here. Rather than coming up with a brand new idea, the commercial world has kind of solved the problem of managing identity to some degree. We just need to customize that here for the state of Illinois. The iLogin system has security built in. So we added identity validation and verification as a requirement before residents can access sensitive information. So not only are we validating them using modern techniques, are you coming from a new phone or a new device, but we can also verify that the person is who they say they are. Programs that we have where you come in service or in person to an office, a field office, often you present some kind of identity credentials to get registered, a driver's license, identification card, a social security card. In the digital world, those same techniques have to be modified, and we have to do things through a slightly different way to verify that the resident is who they say they are so that we can provide the appropriate protection to them. It built into our system additionally is user self-service methods. So we want people to be able to reset their accounts using those kind of password recovery methods that we're all familiar with through commercial and e-commerce in our daily lives. So by leveraging commercially available software, we are able to do that such that the resident experience is familiar. It seems like when you go to a bank or if you forget your password to Netflix or whatever that is, you're recovering it in a similar way. I want to talk a little bit about just building on one of the bigger challenges that we saw here. And I think Shane really hit on it. He talked about authenticator assurance levels. And I know these are kind of technical terms, but these are NIST standards, right? So Shane in Iowa is not coming up with his own set of criteria by which he should determine what level of risk is acceptable, nor are we in Illinois, right? So we're following the NIST standards. So on the next slide, we talk about this other notion of identity verification, and that goes against the NIST standards of identity assurance levels. This is the idea, the concept that you would do the level of due diligence based on the sensitivity of the information. So certainly anyone is free to take a free flyer from the lobby of the grocery store on their way out. But in order to get, my prescription drugs, I would have to verify some level of something when I go to do business at a pharmacy, right? So it's that same notion in the electronic world. This notion that we would provide countermeasures and add friction to the user transaction to verify that users are who they say they are before we grant them access to sensitive information. And most often the sensitive information is about them. So rather than just trusting that someone that knows Adam Ford and my social security number, which is pretty trivial for an attacker to know, we're going to ask questions. You may have seen some of these techniques when you open a bank account. There are a number of credit bureaus that are consulted, other identity sources that can be verified, and then also other elements of the user's device can be queried against to ensure that this makes a lot of sense. Someone that knows everything about me and my favorite, my mother's maiden name, my social security number, but is trying to log in from Moscow at the same time that we know that I happen to be based here in the state of Illinois, is unlikely to be proving that they actually are themselves. And so this, I think, with regards to driving zero trust towards resident identity, this is the area I think that is the bigger policy lift or the bigger cheese move amongst agency program staff. It's a culture shift to take people from username and password for those systems that, as I described, were built around the program and not around the resident's interaction, and get the program staff and the agency staff to understand that that it is mandatory for the state to protect this resident identity, right? To ensure that only Shane can view Shane's record, and we need to make sure he is Shane and have him validate with appropriate levels of authentication technology, including MFA, when he's seeing sensitive things about himself. It's really a big change, and I think there's a lot that we've done here in the state to bring about that change and make sure that key decision makers at agencies understand the responsibility related to verifying identity before we do those additional interactions. This is very much not a technology problem that we're solving here. This is a business interaction problem. This is a resident problem. And so that I think is one of the bigger challenges for CISOs outside. The technology is hard, but the integration and the building sponsorship, I think, is the bigger area. Specifically, for social programs where we're dealing with individuals who may be in unfortunate circumstances, the challenge becomes how much friction do you put between the program and the person, such that you ensure that there's access to the service, but in the same way, provide that resident and the state the ability to protect that person from further victimization through identity fraud and things of that nature. I think that I've got a couple slides just kind of show really quickly like what this looks like here in the state, like what we mean for the state of Illinois. Why does this look? We don't want it to look really that unique. So if we could hit the next slide, this is kind of user registration, or this is the page that describes iLogin. I think other states have similar pages, but residents can come here to sign up and get started with their accounts in this location. The next slide, please, will show how you create an account. This should look really familiar, right? This is not that different than any commercial service that you're interacting with. We allow the user to create the account. As part of the account creation, they're going to set up multi-factor authentication out of the box. So it doesn't seem like an add-on or an additional burden to the resident. It's just part of the process as they create the account. Same thing for their self-service password and account recovery methods, that they set that on here as well. And then next slide, I think my final slide just kind of shows this account self-service. So if you're a resident interacting with the state of Illinois and you forget your password, like can happen with a commercial entity, so long as you have access still to the email account that you use to set this up, you can request a password reset sent to your email address or have it sent to your cell phone on record. Same thing for unlocking your account. So kind of as a quick run through of what we've done here, it's a little bit different than Zero Trust, I think, that Shane described in terms of internal. We know less about the residents than we know about our own employees, but we still have that same kind of obligation to do our due diligence here in securing their identities. So, Mitch.
Excellent. Thanks, Adam. And before we move to the fireside chat, we did get a question come in from the chat box. Specifically around identity verification, what identity verification tool are you using today as part of your account creation process within the state of Illinois?
Yeah, there's a number of them. Here in Illinois, we use Experian. They offer a brokerage service for different methods. They're obviously LexisNexis, TransUnion, I assume the Equifax has it as well. I know there's a variety of different services that are available. We chose Experian because it was already in use here in the state of Illinois, and it does offer a variety of countermeasures. We consulted with Gartner and then again looked at what was already deployed there. I think in Illinois, a lot of things are driven by procurement code and procurement approaches, but ultimately, regardless of which specific vendor is selected, I think key to this is understanding and working with your program staff that there is a level of risk assurance that you get to, like how much friction provides how much confidence that the person is who they are. And I think that's where, here in Illinois, we focus a lot on, that's not a cybersecurity, that's not a CISO's decision that I, Adam Ford, decide how sure I should be that someone is who they say they are before they apply for unemployment benefits. In Illinois, we actually have different standards of identity verification for different services. So applying for unemployment benefits might have a higher bar than registering for a campsite, for example. But that's kind of where we drive that as ultimately it's a business risk decision. Like, are you going to accept at a campsite a photocopy of a driver's license, or do you require a real driver's license? It's the same concept electronically.
Yeah, and I think that approach is spot on, right? When it comes to aligning the different business applications with the IAL and the AAL levels, because you're also then blending in that seamless, experience, right, for that given resident of the state of Illinois. You don't want to have to make him go, him or her go through all this work to get access to a campsite, right? But to file for unemployment, right, that's where we definitely need to take that a step further. So again, spot on, and really appreciate, all the additional, insights that you've provided around what the state of Illinois is doing from a resident Zero Trust perspective with identity. So with that, I think we're ready to move into our fireside chat. I have the pleasure of being joined by probably the two biggest titans in the cybersecurity space that I know personally. So really looking forward to kind of getting into this a bit. So first question, and I'll pose this to you, Adam, and then we'll get Shane's take on this as well. But we've talked about identity a little bit here, but where do you envision identity fitting into the overall Zero Trust framework? And where do you see identity in the future of that? Any, insights there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, with pillars, all pillars are important to hold up the roof. I think it's absolutely critical, though. And to large measure, I think in state government, identity, both of employees and partners and of residents, is an area where there is a lot of, there's currently probably a lot of gaps in terms of like that sophistication level. We've used usernames and passwords for decades. We've used a variety of different ways of interacting with both the public and with our employees for decades, but driving at sources of truth or different levels of validation in order to have that as like to know who someone is as such a key element of then determining what to grant them access to. I think it's just a very key and critical element. I think most state governments, specifically, most states have a pretty good idea of the hardware assets and the software they might have installed on their systems, but what their users have rights to. There's been a lot of, I think, creep over the years, and none of us, no one on this call is working from what we would call a greenfield environment. Like, we're not starting from scratch. We are working with a going concern. So I fundamentally think identity is, probably the primary area of focus, of emphasis for, at least in our state, and I think probably in most states, is where we have the largest area to come first before we're able to really, if you don't know who you're dealing with, it's very hard to know what to do with them.
Right. And the way that I kind of see it too is that, if you're a given state and you're trying to launch, a zero trust initiative, whether that be like an SD-WAN project or like a SASE initiative or something along those lines, I feel like it's really hard to execute those projects if you haven't figured out the identity piece first, because how else are you going to authenticate and authorize those individuals? So couldn't agree more there. Shane, your thoughts?
So I started my career in the United States Air Force and spent 8 years there. It was a great learning opportunity for me. And I was able to understand not only the social aspects of people, the technology, but also physical security too. And as I reflect on identity, that is the core of everything. The easiest way to make it into anything is to steal someone's identity, right? In some way, shape, or form. Because if you can be that person, you can have access to everything they have access to in their life. And I think that is really at the core, to me, to any zero trust. You can have all the security things in the world, but how are these attackers getting in? They're phishing someone, they're getting a credential, they're doing something that allows them to get authorized access into your environments, and then using that to laterally move across your environments. And I think, from my perspective, that's really important. But I'd also say with number one pillar for me being identity, I also don't want to bring on a ton of help desk staff and provisioners, and I can't afford to do that, right? And traditionally, you would bring on a team of 5, 10, 15, 20 people just to go and provision accounts, and we have to rethink the way we do that. And I would highlight, we do have a feature request in through Okta, and I think going back to the importance of it, we want to tie the IAL and AAL levels into Okta as templates, right? We don't want to spend time creating those. We want something from the federal government that we can apply in Okta that allow us to automate those different things. And I know that's a current feature request, but I would say it's a critical thing. And Mitch, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that feature request.
Yeah, I mean, Shane, you're again, I think that just kind of speaks to Okta and the state of Iowa's partnership, right? You bringing us that feedback and saying, hey, we need an easier way to go about, aligning to different IAL and different AAL levels, within Okta, right? Taking that to us and then allowing us to start executing on that is why I think, we have this valuable partnership. We need to learn from what you're seeing, so then that way we can improve the product and make it better over time for not just the state of Iowa, but again, also Adam's state of Illinois and the rest of the states and territories in the United States. So again, I don't think if we didn't have that partnership, we wouldn't have been able to get that feedback to, again, improve the product and make it better going forward. So again, appreciate the additional insights there. So Shane, we'll go to you for the next question, and really this is just around NIST, right, and federal guidelines. So as you know, NIST has released a ton of guidance around identity assurance levels and authentication assurance levels. How have these guidelines personally affected your implementation of identity controls to ensure that your zero trust implementation aligns to the federal guidelines?
There's a couple of different ways I think about it. The first is, we have to be in compliance. So we're always going to strive to do that. But I think about also, there are really smart people at the federal government who are thinking about these things holistically. And, if I have a choice of adopting something that someone else does or creating it myself, I would rather adopt, right? They've already spent the time, they thought through it. They've collaborated with the private sector, with other entities. If I can borrow from someone, great, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that is really important. As I think about templating for Iowa, we take these groups of best practices and we adopt what makes sense for us. We're never going to hit 100% of the best practices, but if we can hit 40% of it, 20% of it, we're going to be better off than we were. And maybe next year we can take on another 10%. If Adam's doing something really great, same type of thing, Adam, tell me how you're doing, and we'll see what we can adopt and learn from their experiences.
Adam, do you have any other insights into what the state of Illinois kind of envisions from a federal perspective in terms of your identity controls?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think very much the idea of using best practices is important. I mean, clearly we need to innovate. I mean, the federal system is set up such that states can innovate and that other states can learn from one another. And that the federal government can learn from state examples as well. We're 50 experiments going on at the same time. But I think with regards to specific mechanics of things, I think standards just really have a very strong place, and they should. Making sure that we're not, just as I mentioned earlier, like if it was just up to Adam or just up to Shane to determine the most important part about identity, we would probably be mostly right, but we would also be wrong enough each that it just makes more sense to collaborate and work with best practices to ensure that we're doing it all in the same way.
Yeah, and I think when you're following best practices too, it makes, I think, the stress levels of you all, which I'm sure are probably up to here in some cases, right? They're able to at least, reduce, those in some ways, knowing that although, you could probably figure it out on your own, just like putting that risk on the best practices and saying, hey, here's how we're doing it. We're being told to do it this way by the federal government, I think, gives a sense of confidence, for you all, that you are all, again, following the right direction there.
And I think it does play in sometimes to federal guidelines that come out down for states. I know early in the pandemic, like the Department of Labor, right? Bureau of Labor Statistics and Department of Labor had set unemployment insurance guidelines that actually would go against some more modern multi-factor authentication methods and things like that, some of these more restrictive ways. Clearly, they've shifted course, but they shifted course to a standards-based approach using NIST. So by following along with those standards and guidelines, I think in terms of dealing with compliance, which is sometimes just as much a part of our jobs as security, going with best practices won't leave you high and dry in terms of having to change direction at the whim of a federal agency.
I couldn't agree more, for sure. So continuing on, with our fireside chat, Shane, I know this is probably, close at heart with you. What are some of the strategic considerations that you have when it comes to building out a zero trust ecosystem? Going beyond just identity, what are some of the other things that you're thinking about when designing your zero trust deployment?
I think resource availability is a big one, and also the capabilities of our own teams. So, when I think about things, what makes sense to outsource, what makes sense to insource, and kind of think about that from that lay of the land and priorities, right? So if we know something is being attacked and is an entry point into our infrastructure, we're going to prioritize that. And it probably means we're going to bring in a third party who's really, really good at that and really working through those different challenges. But, you can't do it all yourself. And I think we are in a situation in our roles where we can't find enough qualified staff to do this work. So we have to be thoughtful in the way we do these things. And that really is the strategic aspect of it is, we have to plan long-term. Is that a third party who helps us? Are we going to invest in staff internally? And then how do we maintain those staff and then keep those moving forward? Because you have the best plan in the world, but if you don't have the people to do the plan, it's not going to matter. So I think those are things that I think about in this scenario is how do I actually operationalize these things?
Well, right. I mean, if you don't have the staff to do the work, I mean, nothing's going to get done anyhow. Like you said, you could have the best plan, but if the staffing isn't there, it's not going to happen. And I've seen that time and time again with the other states that I've worked with as well. So again, I couldn't agree with you more on that one. Shane, what are some of your thoughts there? Or excuse me, Adam, what are some of your thoughts there?
No, I mean, I think like clearly we hit some of this, but like to some degree, we look at these kinds of functions, zero trust as a whole, like it seems like a big lift. It's a culture shift, right? From feeling safe inside the castle walls to not. But it definitely empowers organizations to use automation for more things. The more that we discreetly know the users we interact with or the data that they're interacting with, the more we can leverage automation and orchestration technologies to reduce the workload requirement and add to that security. So it's really a lot of state services require human interaction to interpret resident input or program requirements and output those into official actions. And I think as we move more and more to zero trust, we kind of are commoditizing the different pieces of those transactions digitally. And that is going to allow us, I think, to do a more broad transformation. I think identity transformation and then the zero trust move will have an outsized impact on the ability for state IT operations to deliver efficiency that I think we haven't seen before. And I think it's largely driving towards that standardization. And I mean, the fifth pillar on the CISA chart is data, right? And ultimately data is really what this is all about to a certain degree. It's like the goal for the other four pillars to hold up. that data that states have that allow us to perform our business functions, and that sensitive information for residents and for employees is absolutely critical. So the closer and the more we're able to mature towards that, so we're actually able to use that data both to make these kinds of decisions, like in order to be able to classify data so that we can perform the correct security function on it, also likely is going to yield advanced analytics capabilities for that data once it's well defined, to ensure that we can maybe determine our programs working in conjunction with each other effectively. Just kind of like a coattail benefit of moving in a more secure direction for Zero Trust.
It's so interesting, again, like the different aspects that come about, from any kind of security standardization, on, something like a Zero Trust architecture. There's a bunch of auxiliary benefits, I think, come that way that other states, I'm sure, could take advantage of, such as, like, again, the data analytics and the data insights that you're probably collecting, Adam, from the different resident identities that are interacting with different, again, applications and services, all within the state of Illinois. So definitely very powerful stuff there. I think we have we have time for one question, for this fireside chat. And really, it just kind of gets back to, you guys are the experts, right? You guys have done this before. What advice would you have for other states who are looking to adopt their own Zero Trust architecture? What's one thing that a CISO or CIO on the phone, or a security architect on the line, what's one thing that they could take with them to bring back and start working on internally? And Shane, you can weigh in on that one first.
I think that the most important thing is being able to change culture, right? And it's create champions, it's to connect with people, to build credibility. My first year here in Iowa was that, meeting with the governor's office, meeting with senior leadership, meeting with local governments. And I know there was a question from James specifically how you approach local governments and entities, but it's really focusing on building relationships and then putting people in positions where you're constantly feeding them information. And really, when bad things happen, when there's an attack that happens in Iowa, we're there helping them. We understand, and we're helping them pick up the pieces, which helps with our credibility, right? So we're taking that whole state approach of, yes, we're trying to be proactive, but we're also firefighting. And the better reputation we have, the more people want to talk to us. And I think that's true for anything. When you're not connecting with people, when you're setting a mandate for people, they're going to tell you to pound sand, right? And we can't have that. We need people to be bought in, because security, cybersecurity, and Zero Trust architecture is really everyone's responsibility. We have to figure out how we convince people to follow us in these regards. So that's the one thing that I would have people think about, is that human interaction and connection.
That's perfect. So in addition to getting buy-in, from the different humans and different users within a given state, Adam, is there anything else that you would like to add there, around Zero Trust recommendations?
Yeah, no, I think, on top of the technical stuff, I think it's very important, for anyone that's starting on this journey, and we all are, to be really introspective and be honest with yourself, and have, encourage honesty amongst your teams about what information you really know. I think it can be really easy to take for granted that we know a lot about our users, or we know a lot about our systems. And oftentimes, as you try to get into a sophisticated implementation, you realize that you don't. You have to understand, why did you, for example, think you knew who all your users were? Were they tied, for example, as Shane mentioned, to your HR system, in which case they're pretty trustworthy, or were they added, due to manual tickets? I think there's got to be a lot of honesty in operational practices, and then that buy-in and change for those people around you. But on top of that, in terms of winning other, directors over, leadership within states and in both the executive branch and the legislature, it's important to be able to tell the narrative of why this is important, and how, the pandemic taught us a lot of lessons in terms of the importance of protecting resident identities in ways that I think states took for granted before. And I think that, the ability to sit with program staff and understand the business need they're trying to solve. We are interacting as states with people who still use flip phones, and with people who I'm certainly know more about how to use their smartphone than I do. And we do have to cross all of those thresholds. Not every method of resident interaction has to be available as easily to everyone. So if people wish to interact with us digitally, which they do in increasing measure, then they do, and I know there was a question about this, they do have to get comfortable with multi-factor authentication. We have some of our applications where we'll have pushback from programs that they don't necessarily want to use MFA, but 85% of the people interacting have a smartphone and are interacting via a smartphone. So I think in some ways giving, knowing that the defense of identity is important, that the defense of the systems is important, and that our residents, they're capable of working with us. Where we can't do that, we need to provide alternative methods for them to receive those services. Post-pandemic, it's not just digital interactions that can do so.
Excellent. So I think that concludes our fireside chat. We'll now move into the open Q&A from the NGA audience. So the first question, again, from James, this is directed to Shane. As a state government entity, there are some challenges of authority over different branches of government. What would you suggest the approach be for a state trying to implement Zero Trust for the entire enterprise if the CIO office has pushback from other branches to centralize IT efforts towards Zero Trust?
Yeah, I think the key is being able to have open dialogues with the leaders of those organizations. So when I think about Iowa, I have 63 agencies across 3 branches of government, 99 counties, 900 cities, education, not-for-profit. I need to put people in positions where they can have good discussions and help change the mindsets of these businesses and these executives who are in these roles. You're always going to have resistance, and you have to think about why is that? Is it because they've had a bad experience with security? Is it because the person prior to you, the CIO or CISO, focused a lot on fear, uncertainty, and doubt rather than business value? You have to try and figure out why that is, and then build communication strategies and change strategies to help convince them and turn them into champions for you. And I think that's really key is you take people who are resistant to you and turn them into people who are advocates for you. If you can do that, it speaks a lot of volumes and helps change culture. And they say that, change requires people to retire. And today we don't have time for that. So we have to think about alternatives to change that culture.
And Adam, this is a question for you just around iLogin. Are all iLogin accounts right now required to set up multi-factor authentication? If so, has that requirement met any kind of resistance from the business or the different residents of the state of Illinois?
Yeah, they are. We don't necessarily require it for all interactions. So like, registering for a park bench, for example, wouldn't necessarily require it, but changing your account preferences would, things like that. It does. I mean, the business is a bigger pushback than the residents, to be totally honest. The business is often concerned, and by business, I mean government entities. They're very concerned that the users won't be able to interact in that way. Like they want to just use their social security number to interact with the state. Usually, I think when you leverage our experiences with breach and response, I mean, taking systems offline for a week and then coming back with a more secure system is a lot more painful than just going through a multiple week pain period, getting people adjusted to MFA. And the public is used to it at this point. They want to protect their information. They do not wish to receive a breach notification.
Excellent. So last question. I think this, Shane or Adam, I'll let you guys decide who goes first here. But what is there any discussion happening about identity validation being tied to federal Real ID requirements within the state of Iowa or within the state of Illinois?
I see it as part of my vision eventually, where we can work with our DOT and be able to do those type of activities. I think we need to get really good at the processes we have before we consider bringing in those other data sources and to go down that path. But I would envision at some point in time, we will probably explore that.
Yeah, we do. Our DMV here in the state of Illinois is Secretary of State, so separate constitutional office. So we have a new Secretary of State coming in, very digital focused. My expectation is that we will have some correlation between the two. I don't see leadership from the federal government in this area because they really seem to be more standard setting and not involved. But I do think that digital services, including drivers and Real ID, I think there is a place for that with this as well.
It's just a matter of time, right? We'll see, if there's any further federal guidelines around, Real ID and how that might apply to the state and local government level, for sure.
Yeah.
So that concludes our webinar for today. Casey, I'll go ahead and turn it over back to you. But thank you again all for attending.
Thanks all.